Λοιπόν, γεια σας και πάλι. Ελπίζω να ξεκουραστήκατε, να φάγατε, να χωνέψατε. Και θα μπούμε αμέσως σε ένα θέμα που μας απασχολεί πολύ έντονα το τελευταίο διάστημα και δεν είναι άλλο από το κατά πόσο ο μαθητής, ο δάσκαλος, ο δημοσιογράφος, ο πολίτης εν γέννη μπορεί να σταθεί, αν έχει τα εργαλεία, αν έχει το απαραίτητο υπόβαθρο, να σταθεί κριτικά απέναντι σε αυτό που βλέπει, ακούει, διαβάζει. Απέναντι στην είδηση δηλαδή. Αν μπορεί να ξεχωρίσει τι είναι είδηση και τι είναι κάτι άλλο από αυτό. Αυτό λοιπόν που λέγεται media literacy και που δουλεύουμε και ερευνητικά αλλά και εφαρμοσμένα πλέον στο μεταπτυχιακό μας, παρακάλεσα πάρα πολύ τον Dan Gilmore να μας κάνει ένα εργαστήρι πάνω στον εγγραμματισμό στα μέσα. Έχει γράψει αυτό το βιβλίο πριν από 2 χρόνια. Σας έχω στείλει το βιβλίο. Μας ζήτησε να προετοιμαστούμε για να μπορέσουμε να δουλέψουμε μαζί του. Είναι πραγματικά μια πολύ σημαντική στιγμή να έχουμε μαζί μας τον Dan Gilmore και να μας κάνει εργαστήρι στο Media Literacy. We thank him so much that he's with us and he's going to spend his precious time trying to literate us, media-wise. Dan Gilmore, thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me today and hanging in here on a long weekend. The weather is so nice out there. I'm tempted to go out and go visit the tourist spots, but I'll do that tomorrow. This is really an honor to be here, and I'm grateful to Sophia and others who brought me here. This is a wonderful city. I wanted to just mention a couple of things. What I want to do today is take you through in the next hour or so the way I approach the subject of media literacy. I don't do it the way people who are traditional media literacy people do it. The field has some wonderful, wonderful scholars working, and I don't try to copy what they do. I try to do something in my own methodology that is aimed at not people who are studying journalism necessarily, but people who are wanting to figure out how they can navigate through the flood of media that is coming their way, and it feels more and more important that we help people do that. And I think journalism schools can play a huge role in helping people with media literacy inside, outside the schools, and the need for it seems more and more clear to me. We've had things like the Brexit vote that in the UK was done partly because the media were deliberately, some of the media were deliberately misleading the people. And that strikes me as a big, big problem. In the US right now we have a presidential campaign going on featuring in one party somebody who just never stops lying and seems immune to anything that media do about that. And I worry that we have around the world people becoming just deciding that they're going to go with the facts they want even if they're not facts, and we have a lot we can do about it. In any event, I don't want to get too depressing on this. I wanted to explain to you how I'm approaching it, and what I'm going to be using in large part here today is material that is online in a massive open online course, a MOOC, that some of you may have done or taken, that we offered last year. And the materials, all of the course materials, are still online and available, and they're all licensed under a Creative Commons license, which means that anyone can download everything there and use it again if they want to in any way they want. So all the materials I'm going to show you are available. If you decide you want to do something with them yourselves, that's fine. It's all free for other people's use. So it's also based in part on a book I wrote in 2009 called Media Active, and that was based on my belief that we needed better media literacy. And I based the course on that. I teach one now at Arizona State University online. Actually, I teach two media literacy courses. One is more aimed at consumers of media, the other is aimed more at creators of media, which I think we are all doing both. And again, that book is also free to download. Anybody who wants to read it, you're welcome to go and find it and download it. All my books are always published under Creative Commons license because I believe that's the best way to do it. So let me get started. This is what I'm showing you is the MOOC, the course that we offered through something called edX, which was started by MIT and Harvard, and Arizona State is part of the consortium that operates this. And the material included a lot of lectures from me, lots of readings, and also probably the best part is interviews that I did with people in the media and in technology and in the arts and other fields that were related to the media to have them talk about this topic. So I have some pretty great interviews up there with at least people who are well known in the U.S., if not so much in other countries, but they're the best people I know in this area. And that's, again, all of it's free to download and reuse by anybody. Let me go the book is there's a website called Mediactive, mediactiv.com, mediactive.com. The course is at edx.org, and there's a link from my own site, the book site, to the course, so you can find there. I'll make all this. I'll give everything to Sophia, and she can share it with you. And I'll put a post on my personal blog later on of where you can find all these things at dangilmore.com. So let me start. Let me just review a couple of things from yesterday to set the scene for what I'm working on. If you recall, this new media environment that we're in of information going in strange ways, and the idea that access is replacing traditional distribution, and the consumers becoming creators and then collaborators. And we have an endless supply of media, as you heard from Charlie earlier, Charlie Beckett and others, everything from things we can identify completely as journalism, like the New York Times. I don't think anyone here will dispute that they do journalism. I think we all will agree on that. They don't always get things right. They make some occasionally terrible mistakes, but they do journalism by any standard I can come up with. So I put that on just one edge of this continuum, whereas I might put that on another side of another area of the continuum, saying that's not journalism. I'd like to By the way, I love the fact that there's a blog. I think people creating media is a wonderful thing, but that's just not journalism. That's the only point I'm making. Likewise, the BBC does journalism, and a YouTube video of Nat and Foxy doing their bad dancing to bad music is not journalism. The same sort of thing, but the lines, we all know, have blurred a lot between what is and isn't journalism, and certainly between who is a journalist and who isn't. And I want to emphasize what Charlie said earlier. I no longer care who we call a journalist. I care a great deal about what we call journalism, and the lines there are blurring in some fascinating ways. And this is a photo that many of you, I think, will remember. It's from a video captured in the streets of Tehran a number of years ago after violence following an election, and this young woman whose name was Nida was shot by a sniper and killed in the street. Someone walking by with a phone that is also a camera took a video of this tragic, horrible event, and it made its way around the world rather quickly. And this was an act of journalism, no question about it, an act of journalism by someone who was not a journalist. So again, I want to focus on that in terms of where we are in this general area. It doesn't take much money anymore to start a media organization. This was a blogger who has now built a real media organization, Josh Marshall in the US. It's political coverage, it's terrific. And local coverage. Some of these I'll show you. And in Singapore, people telling each other what's going on in ways the government doesn't necessarily like, and they get in trouble for it, but they're doing a good job. Another, increasingly I read experts on topics that interest me. The ones who can write in plain language and who are real experts. So I happen to be interested in paleoanthropology, and there's a professor at a university in the US who writes the best blog on that subject that I know about, and so he's my news source for that particular subject. There are lawyers who write the best journalism, in my view, interpretive journalism about the law. They explain it to me. There's a blog that covers the Supreme Court decisions in real time. They do live coverage in the US, and it's the best there is. There's no newspaper nearly as good at doing that. So I go to the experts directly, and as I said yesterday, I also go strongly now to the NGOs and advocates who I believe are doing journalism when it's something I care about, and for human rights issues, it's Human Rights Watch that's doing the best journalism. And there are a lot of examples, more of this, that I could come up with. And what I try to tell students in this area of media literacy is that we're in a world where it's not journalists or bloggers. That, as people have been arguing about whether bloggers are journalists for years, and it's crazy to argue that. Some bloggers do journalism, most don't. I'm interested in particular in the ones who do. I think of it as journalists and bloggers and people on Twitter and YouTube, and where it's journalism and providing quality information, that's what I care about. So I keep that focus. And we're creating a strange media ecosystem of that this is a slide that changes all the time, and it's just a very simple depiction, and it's quite inaccurate in ways. But I think of media in this basic quadrants of things like very niche topics and tiny audiences, all the way to know particular topics and giant audiences, and in the case of Facebook, both users and audiences at the same time. They're creating all the media, but it's a this ecosystem that we're getting, I find fascinating, and it changes all the time, but this and notion rather than or feels very important as we look at it. After I did the book We the Media, the reason I did that next book was in the latter part of the last decade, I was starting to worry a lot about how people were getting quality information, or if they were. And I thought it was wonderful that media, I thought it was terrific that media had now exploded in numbers, that we had all kinds of new things out there, but I wasn't clear that people were going to the things that they could find trustworthy. And we know that from history that people tend to prefer, when they buy media, they tend to prefer tabloid kinds of journalism. They buy more of it than they buy quality journalism, so that's not new. But with the amount of stuff out there growing at large exponential rates, and people still tending to get information in traditional ways, suddenly we had this arena of too much information. I don't know what that bell is, but too much information, and much of it is garbage, which everyone here knows that. But how do we deal with that? How do we sort the good from the bad? And how do we know what's accurate and what's trustworthy, especially in a world of things like Photoshop, where people can make things up as they do in text all the time in our various social media feeds, and I'm sorry to say in traditional media as well, as we saw in Brexit and as we see often in the US. But the Photoshop world creates things like that image, which is a composite, two pictures put together by Photoshop, and this went racing around the internet immediately after the September 11th attacks in the US. And it was quickly shown by people to be fake. But I'm willing to bet that there are still some significant number of people who saw that and remember that picture as having depicted what happened that day, when it's a fake picture. What do we do about that? And these were things I was thinking about as I worked on this book on media literacy. What are we going to do to help people not be fooled? We can't help the people who want to be fooled, or at least not easily. And there are a lot of people who have decided that they don't care what the truth is. They have picked a truth and they're going to stick with it even if it's false. I can't address that very easily. That's up to, that's going to take parents, teachers, and others to, I hope, get to people when they're younger. And that's part of why I did the book. But it's not only people with Photoshop, even our best media organizations make terrible, terrible mistakes. And this is one of the classic bad journalism pieces in the New York Times before the Iraq War, where a reporter was misled or chose to be misled, not clear, I don't know the answer to that, but published outrageously wrong information that had been fed to the New York Times by people who wanted a war. People in government who wanted a war, and the New York Times helped them do it. So we have a bigger problem than people with Photoshop. We have a lot more to deal with. So I decided, as I thought it through, that I would base the book on principles for both people who are, we call them consumers, but people who mostly read, listen, watch, and also principles for creators, because I don't think we're literate in this world unless we're creating media. Not just writing, but various kinds of media. I think that's part of our literacy now, and media literacy people, traditional ones, will say that writing is part of media literacy. They take a slightly different approach, but I think we should think of it that way in general. So the principles for me were that stop just consuming passively. Don't sit back on the couch and let media just happen to you. And I should say, when I say that, I am very happy to sit in the room where our TV is and just watch it and empty my brain out and just let it, go over me like washing my brain off. But that's entertainment, and I'm happy with not participating in entertainment. I'm talking about information that I'm going to make decisions from, or that I need to know. So I want to use the media, not just consume it. And I want all of us to use the media, really use it. And participating is part of it, but to do it in a way that shows integrity. Now, again, I'm not trying to say these are absolute rules for all situations. I love participation just for fun. And I love some kinds of things that I read. There's a website in the US called The Onion. How many of you know that? Well, The Onion is satire. And it's brilliant satire. They're the best. And they actually, in a fictional way, sometimes fiction tells truth more than nonfiction. Well, a lot of their truth is there because they're so good at satire. But at least I know. But I love that stuff. But I don't. That's not what I'm talking about in this case. So here are the quick principles, and I'm going to go into them a little bit deeper. The idea of being skeptical, using judgment, asking your own questions, going outside one's own zone of comfort. Don't live in that bubble. And understand how media are created, and especially how media are used to persuade and manipulate. These are the rules for the so-called consumers, or the principles. And then for the people who create, are necessary now than ever, which is transparent in terms of revealing our biases, whether we have some part of the outcome. So when I wrote recently about the upcoming presidential debate that's going to happen on Monday in the U.S., and I was obliged to say I support Hillary Clinton. But that's not the point of this. The point is, I made some else, but it was necessary to say it would be dishonest not to. So I think transparency is very much important now. So those are the basic principles. Now let me go through some of these in a bit more detail. And what I'm doing here is taking material from the MOOC, the massive online course. This is slightly changed versions of the PowerPoints that I used for giving the lectures. Actually, it's not PowerPoint. I use Linux, not Windows or Mac. It's Open Office, or LibreOffice as they now call it. I strongly urge people to do that, even though it's a little harder. But with that first one of being skeptical, I don't think we have a choice anymore. but to be skeptical about absolutely everything that we see. And I'm especially skeptical about breaking news, because breaking news is often just wrong. And we just have to be skeptical of literally everything. I'm skeptical of the New York Times, which I love, which is America's best newspaper. I am skeptical of every blog I see. I'm skeptical of everything on Twitter. But the skepticism is crucial, partly because we're being treated like fools a lot of the time. That session earlier where I was saying how some studies, medical studies and others, are being shown increasingly to be fraudulent, in part because people are being paid to produce results that may be wrong. Well, this goes on and on in industry that pays for studies or outright lies about what's going on. So there's I won't explain this particular situation, but practically every piece of furniture that has cloth in it in the United States for the last 30 years or so has included a chemical designed to prevent it from catching fire, except that it makes toxic smoke when in fact there is a fire, and it's much worse. It doesn't really retard the fire much, and it kills people or very badly injures their lungs. This was done through bad science, junk science. There's a man in the UK named Ben Goldacre, Goldacre, who has a wonderful blog called Bad Science that debunks bad journalism in part, but he's one of the really great people in this whole field. Things that are made up on social media are so common now. This would take too long to explain, but a well-known journalist saying, and why do we have to be skeptical? It's obvious reasons, because even our best people get things wrong from time to time. Increasingly, people are trying to fake us to make us believe things that are not true. And with the web, when everything can be beautifully designed, a little harder to tell than it used to be whether it's quality. If it was something, a poster on a street lamppost that was poor production values, that or a Super 8 movie back when there was film, different than a well-done production. So a few of the journalistic problems. There was a bombing in Boston during the marathon several years ago, where nothing that people were told at first, or almost nothing, turned out to be true, and people were wrongly being blamed for it. This is a example of. I don't remember exactly when this was, but in the U.S. state of Colorado, where the Rocky Mountains are, one day a report went to the police that this balloon had gone up in the air, one of these hot air balloons that people ride, and the parents saying that our son is in the balloon. And so for a couple of hours, the balloon was like CNN's entire coverage and all other TV. It turned out it was a hoax. The boy was not in the balloon. But it was great television. And in the meantime, millions of people were being misled. I get really angry at journalists who don't do their jobs at the times they really should. Before the collapse of the economic bubble that has caused you so much pain in this country, the journalists in the U.S., where a lot of this started with bad loans being made for housing, journalists were cheering for housing prices. That was the standard form of journalism about the housing bubble that was growing. It wasn't any, there was almost no skepticism from journalists about something that was obviously not sustainable. Things don't go up forever. They can't. At a certain point, it just can't continue. And yet, the paper closest to where we live in San Francisco was one of the cheerleaders for housing prices rising forever. And incidentally, housing prices in San Francisco are now even higher than they were at the top of the last bubble. And there will be another correction, and there will be a number of people who lose a lot of money as a result. When the hurricane hit the East Coast in the U.S., someone posted on Twitter that he'd confirmed that there was flooding in the New York Stock Exchange, and this was a really bad thing because it could shut down the computers, etc. And of course, it wasn't true. And he ended up apologizing, but this was a person who, a professional person whose livelihood was hurt by doing that, but it was only because people found out who he was. There's a site, I don't know how many of you have heard of Snopes? Anybody? Okay, a lot of this is US based, but Snopes basically looks at things that are believed and asks if they're true or not. And sometimes they say true. Often they're saying, nope, sorry, not true. I don't know how well you can see it, but these are pictures supposedly from the same hurricane, with this giant cloud over the Statue of Liberty, and the bottom one, the Statue of Liberty being inundated by a wave. Well, the one at the bottom is from a bad movie where New York City gets destroyed by a tidal wave. So anyone who thought about it for even half a second would have realized it was fake, but that picture was racing around social media by people saying, oh my God, look at this terrible thing. Now, there's no big harm done if people believe something like that, but it's just this collection of bad things that go on. And then there's the case of people who are really trying to fool us. And this is one of my least favorite in a way, which is that Walmart, the big chain of stores in America, paid some people to go blogging around America, this hip couple, but they didn't say they worked for Walmart. And this was put together by a public relations company that was trying to create an image for Walmart that these people were going to help boost its reputation. Well, the result when they were found out was that it lowered Walmart's reputation, which is, I think, a very good thing to do if we can make that happen. And then, of course, things that look, this is one of my favorite, so this is a site that's called dhmo.org. It's devoted to research on dihydrogen monoxide. And some of the categories of information here, this chemical dihydrogen monoxide. So it talks about these DHMO, and so the categories include DHMO and cancer, DHMO in the dairy industry, and on and on. Well, who here knows what DHMO actually is? Just renamed. And people go to this site and think and get scared about the bad effects of water. And I'm not talking about water that's polluted, just basic water. I use this in my course because it's possible to make people worry about things that are completely not to be worried about just by putting up something that looks halfway professional. and this one is really good at it. This is from The Onion. It's too long to explain it. So I emphasize to people, you have to be skeptical of absolutely everything you see. But not equally skeptical. That's the next thing for my students, is don't be equally skeptical of everything you see. I don't know why this slide just turned blue. It shouldn't have. Technology. So this is where I start to work with them on using judgment. And judgment for me starts with figuring out through experience who and what you trust more than not. I said I don't completely trust the BBC. I'm skeptical even of the BBC, but I'm not very skeptical of the BBC. I think they're the best journalism organization, broadcast journalism in the world. Yes, they make mistakes and do some things that bother me, but they're professionals and pretty great journalists. So I trust it a lot more than not. That's my measurement these days, is what do I trust more than I don't trust it. And when it comes to the BBC, they're way in the positive category of things I trust. I don't trust anonymous comments anywhere. I believe we need to preserve anonymity. I think the right to US that rely on unnamed sources, anonymous sources. I think they're costing themselves credibility every time they do it, unless it's some obvious example of where the source can't possibly use his or her name, where the person's life may be at risk or something of that order, and where I trust the journalist. But I have to have both, or I'm not going to go with it. So along the way in working on this, I started putting in my mind what I called my personal credibility scale. By the way, anybody who wants copies of these slides, I'm happy to provide it. I'll leave it all with, actually I'll post it on my blog. You can, if you want it. So I have a personal credibility scale, and as you see, I would put the BBC very much in the positive category, even though it's uneven. It's not, not everything would be in a positive category from BBC, but generally so. And the anonymous comment way over on the other end of the scale. But there's something important about this scale I want to say, and that's that it doesn't start with 0. And this feels important to me in the way I think about credibility. The anonymous commenter on some random site, especially somebody who's anonymous and trying to attack somebody else, I think that person would have to work very, very hard to persuade me that they deserve any credibility at all. They'd have to work hard just to get to 0. They start out negative. Some things vacuum credibility out of the ecosystem, and I think anonymous stuff that's attacking people is one of those examples. So I don't start the credibility at 0. It's not like you have no credibility or you have some. You can actually have less than no credibility. And I try to get students to think of it that way. Now, and I don't know if this is the right way to frame it, but it's how I've concluded in what I'm doing. So one of the most interesting innovations at Amazon is in this category is that if you read reviews, if you ever buy from Amazon, some reviewers have real names attached to their reviews because Amazon has their credit card information and can actually verify that it's a real person. Now, that's Somebody who uses a real name that's verified gets credibility from me to start. Doesn't mean they're going to be honest in their posting, but I think people who use their real names tend to have more credibility. Although lately there's some data that says they don't behave much better in social networks. The trolling is done just as much by people using real names on Facebook as the ones who don't. I would assume some of you have Facebook accounts under names that are not your actual names. I think most people ought to. When I was using Facebook, which I don't anymore, I had two. I had accounts. One was actually me, and the other was a fake name because I didn't want tracking to be done, and I wanted to see what other people were saying. I think Facebook should let people use not their real names the way Twitter. Links don't get enough credit. The hyperlink tells me you have something to back up what you're talking about. And that's why I said earlier that Wikipedia is an amazing thing, in part because the articles all have a series of links at the bottom of a good article that takes you to source material. And I tell students that Wikipedia is a wonderful place to start when they're doing research. Fabulous. It's a bad place to stop. I don't let them cite Wikipedia in a paper, but I encourage them to start at Wikipedia and then go further and to the original, to the source material. So for that purpose, I think it's terrific. And incidentally, Jimmy Wales, who founded Wikipedia, kind of agrees with that. He thinks he told me, and he's one of my interviews in the MOOC. He said that he would fail a student who cited Wikipedia in a scholarly paper, that he wouldn't allow that himself. So this is an active process in finding trust, and I just strongly believe people earn it over time. They don't start with it, but they earn it. Part of what we're dealing with now is this barrage of advertising, that's advocacy, it's propaganda, and these start to blend, and it's hard to it's sometimes hard to remember how advertising has changed. In the newspaper I worked at, when it was printed and sent out on trucks to people, you knew what an ad was. It was really clear. But it's a little different in online media to know what an ad is, and not everyone does know. And certainly kids are having more and more, I don't know if it's the word trouble, but not all kids know what ads are. And then you get into things like sponsored content. I'm not sure what you call it here, but content that shows up in otherwise journalistic places but is written by or for advertisers or by marketing people. This is one of the ways that the media industry in the US is trying to save itself financially. And I would assume is the true around the world in places. But it's causing some real problems for credibility, because if it's not very clearly identified as advertising, I don't think calling it sponsored content is sufficient. I disagree with people who say that's enough of an identification for an average person to understand. Maybe after a few years it'll work, but sponsored content should be labeled advertising. And I work a lot with students on that. This was a movie several years ago called The Intern, of these guys who were interns at Google. This movie was an advertisement for Google, as far as I'm concerned. It was, I've never seen anything so flattering to Google. And I like Google, in most ways. I think, I have to say, I've known Larry and Sergey since they started the company, and I think they're basically honest guys, and I think that they're trying to do the right thing. They don't always do the right thing, but this movie should have embarrassed them because it just felt like a big commercial. I mentioned earlier in today and yesterday that this new area of advocacy becoming journalism, and I'm completely fine with that. But I think we have to explain to our students and to our families and our kids and others that this is not the standard form of journalism from the past. These people have an issue they want to talk about, and they're going to pursue advocacy on that issue, and we should understand it from that framework. So while I think it's part of the journalism ecosystem, it's not pretending to be neutral, and we should understand that the worldview is there. And that goes back to that issue of transparency. The fact that an advocate is transparent about what they're advocating for is good enough for me, as long as it's really, really transparent. The Guardian has gone on several campaigns in the last couple of years where they say, this is what we believe and this is the journalism we're doing to help make you believe it too. But the Guardian and most papers in the UK have been have had world views, the way they see things, that are not neutral for a long time. So there's a tradition of that there. I don't know enough about media here to know what happens, but I assume that there's lots of partisan journalism, which is increasing around the world, and is becoming very prevalent in the United States. And I have to say, I'm happier with partisan journalism that's labeled as partisan journalism than I am with partisan journalism where they pretend that they're neutral. So, you know, I don't like Fox News in the United States. I think they're not honest. I think they do terrible things. But it's clear what their point of view is. It's clear. I thought their slogan, which they no longer use, when they started, was insulting to their viewers. They used to say, "We are fair and balanced." Well, they were neither fair nor balanced. That's like 2 lies in 3 words. It's amazing that they would do that. But it's clear. So you know, fine. I don't like that they put on things that aren't true, but that's, I can't stop that. At least we know where they're coming from. I think the New York Times is a liberal newspaper, and I think they ought to just say so. They're a corporate liberal newspaper. I mean, they have a corporate view of things. But on social matters and most policy, it's it's left of center in the U.S. In most of Europe, it would be centrist at most, or even a little bit right-wing, but in the U.S. it's left. So I want people to just say what they are, and people are smart enough to understand and to do what to read things with the understanding of where you're coming from, and it works, I think, better as long as people don't only read one thing or watch only one thing. And then some of this goes off into outright propaganda. And again, no, propaganda is not journalism, but it's very much part of the media that that we and our kids are getting all the time, and we have to help people understand what propaganda is. I recommend a website started by Renee Hobbs at the University of Rhode Island. She is in the U.S. the premier expert on media literacy, and it's I'll have a link to it. But she has a site devoted to propaganda where they talk about what it is, they help people understand what it is, and they make one very important point, that not all propaganda is false. And not all propaganda is necessarily bad for you. Propaganda is aimed at persuasion. And this is an example I'm showing you of what I would call good propaganda, which is to persuade parents to get their children vaccinated against common childhood diseases, which is well proved to provide a what they call a herd immunity of the society. Not completely, but countless lives have been saved by vaccinations. I like this propaganda, and I hope we get more of it. But sometimes propaganda is aimed at persuading people to do things that are either based on lies or arguably just bad ideas. And there was a lot of propaganda in the months before the United States invaded Iraq more than a decade ago. And a lot of it was just false. And news organizations were very much part of it. So this Media Education Lab site on propaganda is really worth taking a look at. It's there's a link there, but I'll make it clear. So I want people to use judgment. This is just so strange that this thing has turned blue. I don't know how that happened. Another principle is asking questions, and I don't buy things based on advertising. I buy things after I research if they're expensive. But when I say to people they have to ask their own questions, what I don't, you can't go and re-report every story you read. Obviously, no one's going to jump on a plane and fly to Kabul to see if the New York Times got their latest Afghanistan story right. That's not going to happen. I basically going to have to trust them. But on things where I'm deeply concerned, I'm going to read a lot more widely, and on things where I'm going to make a personal decision, I'm going to ask a lot of questions if it's the bigger the decision is. The more questions I'm going to ask. And it may involve simply reading more widely, but it could be going and asking people. And again, there's a growing area in U.S. media to help people sort out fiction from truth, especially things that are widely believed. And these are a couple of those sites. A man named Howard Rheingold, who he's a writer and educator. Howard has been ahead of everybody when it comes to the effect of technology on our society. For about 30 years, he's been first to know things. If you've not read his work, it's amazing. And Howard has a phrase he calls it crap detection. That we have to have a crap detector built into our brains these days, or we're going to get things wrong. And he has these tactics for doing it, and it's wonderful. I've got links to it. You can ask questions more easily online than we could in the past, and sometimes get expert answers. A site called Quora, it's not perfect, but they're pretty good. Sometimes the people who are actually doing things will give you the answer to what they're up to. And again, for things where it really is important to me, I go back to a line that Ronald Reagan borrowed from someone else. I don't exactly know who, but it was trust but verify. And that feels like a good thing to suggest to people in this media literacy world. Again, the Wikipedia, and for my students, I try to emphasize to them that they're in charge of what they're going to know. I'm not the one in charge. I'm just the one trying to help. They have to take charge of not being fooled. They have to take charge of knowing what they're talking about. They have no alternative in a world where there's so much information. And yes, that's harder than it used to be. when we had 3 TV networks in all of the United States. You had 3 TV channels and 1 newspaper in your town. Someone else was in charge of what you knew, basically. And I don't think that was a better world. It was easier, no question, but I don't think it was better. I think we now have the opportunity to know, and we can do things. I say we have to open our minds. We have to be ready to think about things that we don't ordinarily know. You've heard of that thing, the filter bubbles that people talk about. Well, that's often a result of us wanting to believe things, and we have to be careful. We have to go outside of our comfort zone. So it is true, the data, the research is clear. People tend to pay more attention to people who, and follow people who they agree with or who are like them in key ways. And I've been guilty of that too, but I make a point of following people on Twitter and reading journalism and commentary. I make a point of reading things that are politically not what I believe at all. In fact, I make a point of reading things that are going to make me, I know, are going to make me angry because I hate what they're saying so much. But I feel like I have to do that. Partly because I don't know whether it's true for you, but I learn much more from people who think I'm wrong than from people who think I'm right. And a lot of people think I'm wrong about the things I say, which is great. And sometimes they persuade me. I'll tell you more about how I work on not being wrong in a second. It's this comfort zone idea that I tell students, is that don't stay where you're comfortable in your media use. Go where you're not comfortable. And I don't mean when I say that, I do not at all suggest that you go and look at things that are just abusive. I don't think you should invite trolls to come after you, and this is much more of an issue for women than men. Women have much harder problems in many ways online than men do because of the abuse that's so prevalent out there. But it does mean looking for things that are outside of that place where you're already comfortable, and these are a few of the ways I do it. There's a thing called Global Voices Online. That's aggregation of blogs from around the world, some translated into English, some written in English, and they have other languages, but it's a wonderful look at other cultures. Not a necessarily deep look, but much as I travel, and I do travel a lot, I have no idea about a lot of cultures. And I like to read things that are about people not like me. It's a good way to learn something. It's part of this process, and it's, you know, I'm a Caucasian, you know, white person, and I don't have enough black friends. I have some, but it's crucial in America to understand what black people go through, and most white people don't have a clue. I spent 5 years in Detroit, Michigan, which is the most segregated big city in America. And part of the time I was there, I was covering race relations. Wow, did I learn. It was amazing. And not everyone gets that opportunity, but I sure learned about things that I did not have a clue about. So I still try to go outside in cultural and other ways. Even though things like immigration debate in the U.S. are now, it's turned into something based not on facts. I also remind students that if you're starting with the same set of facts, you may not end up at the same conclusion, even if you're starting with actual facts that are the same. And that's especially important time to listen. If we start with the same facts and you think that my conclusion based on those facts is wrong, I feel like I have a real obligation to ask you to explain if it's something important to me. And we don't listen very well in our world. One of the exercises I do in my course is to ask students to write a blog post that says, what have you ever changed your mind on? Talk about it. And some people say, well, I've never changed my mind, and I say, well, if you really are going to stick with that, you're not going to get a passing grade on this particular exercise. I tell them that ahead of time. And some of them still insist they've never changed their minds. And that would be a sign to me of somebody who is just hopelessly unable to learn. But it's a wonderful thing for people to think about, well, what caused them to change their mind? And it's not on something small. I ask them for something of significance that they really believed was this way and discovered it was that way, and what happened. It produces amazing blog posts. Journalists, there's a small thing in journalism, I would like to see more of people saying what you thought was true isn't. I love those stories. The problem with some of these stories is that they're not exactly right. And if you read, this is one of the problems with news about medicine and medical studies in journalism. Depending on what week it is, coffee is either really good for me or going to kill me or somewhere in between. Chocolate is good for me this week, really bad for me that week. I was thrilled when I saw the news that bacon was good for me. Well, no, it turns out it's not. I love bacon, but it's just bad for me, and I'm gonna deal with that. So we have to be wary of the debunking, because sometimes it's just a ping pong table tennis game of not true on either way. There's something, how many of you know about this thing called confirmation bias? It's too academic a term. But confirmation bias is basically, let me show you what confirmation bias is. So pretend I'm two people. I'm now cloned. I'm me here and I'm me here, okay? And so there's like, we're this far apart on some issue that we both care about. That's how far apart we are. And that person over there tells me I'm wrong and gives me very, very solid evidence that I'm wrong. I mean, facts that prove that I'm wrong. But I really care about this issue a lot, and I believe this thing. So what would you imagine I will do once I'm confronted with factual information that I'm wrong about what that person says and that they're right? You think, maybe I'd go a little bit this way. Does that make sense? That I'd get a little bit closer to their position? Doesn't that make sense? I mean, logically? In fact, confirmation bias, here's what happens. I go backwards. The more you want to believe something, the more you will continue to believe it even more strongly when shown evidence that you are wrong. That's confirmation bias. I don't know about you, but I find that very, very scary. And the data are totally clear that people do that. That creates a lot of problems because, and it accounts for a fair amount of Donald Trump's popularity. I'm not going to call all of his supporters idiots, or you know, I think they're misguided. I can't understand why anyone would, confronted with this, make that choice, or I can understand some of it, but people they have decided they believe something, and they're goddamn well going to believe it no matter what. And this is often true with things involving religion, of course, but religion seems to invade. We have religious arguments about things like economics. The people who believe in one kind of economics, no amount of factual information will persuade them to change their minds. They will find anything they can use to show that they're right. That even so with confirmation bias, if you feel like if you're right about any single fact, that you're completely right, and if they're wrong about any single fact, they're completely wrong. That's part of politics now, and we're not better off for that. So that's the backfire effect is related to confirmation bias. The backfire is that step back when shown the evidence. And journalists don't typically think about this, even when they say this is untrue. And this worries me too, because when someone is lying repeatedly, it doesn't feel like it's enough to say that's not true. And there are some ways to deal with confirmation bias. In the US, there's I think, very strange movement of people who don't want to vaccinate their children. They've persuaded themselves that this is dangerous, even though the data really are clear that there will be some adverse reactions to vaccines. There always are, but that the odds are extremely in your favor that nothing will happen, and that you'll protect your children and the children around them. But there's this is not just, by the way, this is not like people on the political right only. There are an enormous number of people in liberal parts of California who are refusing to have their children vaccinated, get vaccinations, and they're just wrong, but they've decided to believe it. And confirmation bias research shows that the way this is not how you persuade them, by calling them bad names. This is the wrong way to persuade. The way to persuade people is to tell them what is right, not what is wrong, and say you're wrong. Repeating what's wrong doesn't help. It makes it worse. Telling people what's true is the only way, it turns out, at least so far in the research I've seen, that's the only way to make much progress with confirmation bias. So there was, for a long time, the Republicans, or some, were spreading a rumor that Obama is a Muslim. And the White House, people in the White House couldn't believe this was getting traction, that they thought this is just ridiculous. But they tried, they basically said, okay, we're just not going to address it. There are more and more rumors. And finally, the way they addressed it was to say President Obama is a Christian. And that didn't persuade the people who still want to believe he's a Muslim, but it showed some statistical impact in people newly becoming convinced of this. But it didn't solve anything particularly, because something like I don't have the exact number, some substantial minority of Republicans believe he's a Muslim, against all evidence. So, of course, there's some substantial minority of Republicans believe that he's not actually an American. They've picked their own truth and they're going to stay with it. Another thing I talk about with students, and we have to work on this as journalists, but in every way, is the idea that everything has two roughly equal sides and we got to get a quote from both sides. That is one of the worst things about journalism today, at least in my country, is the idea that journalists feel like, well, we'll just go get a quote and we'll print both sides even when one of them is lying. That's not journalism. But the example I give of that, if you're writing a story about the Holocaust, you don't need a quote from a Nazi. Sorry. Just, stop. Think. It's not two equal sides. In fact, it's rare that there are only two sides to any particular topic. Usually there are many different nuances, and journalism doesn't do nuance that well. Politicians hate nuance because it doesn't sell. But I argue strongly that getting two sides is not journalism, it's stenography. It's not the same thing. There's an essay that was posted today by someone I know well who's a media critic defending the two sides journalism. This is a guy who likes to be contrary. And naturally I don't agree with him, but I had to read it just to see if he made any good argument. I don't think so, but I did feel necessary to read it. In climate change, American journalism has behaved quite badly until recently. There was a survey a couple of years ago that showed that something like half of the that in a large percentage of stories about climate change, you would always find quotes from people who denied that it was happening, even after the science was very clear that it was happening and that humans are playing a role. Once enough journalists were embarrassed by this, and enough people started basically calling them and saying, you're really embarrassing yourself by doing this. And something is changing in U.S. journalism, and I believe it was Reuters. Well, I forget which journalism company basically said, we don't do that anymore. We're not going to quote climate change deniers every time we write about it. We'll quote them when we're writing about them, which won't be very often. Now, that might be thought of as picking a side, but it's, and science is not always right, as we heard earlier, but on this one, the best evidence is that that's the case, and it also talks about how we should be presenting science to, as journalists and as parents and teachers. Not to say, science is God and you should completely think it's not infallible, but it's the best evidence we have today, and it's been based on this kind of research where we get data and we find a hypothesis, and if we can not find some way to disprove it, we tend to believe it more than not. But that's full of nuance, and it leads people to find ways to say, well, obviously you don't really believe it. That's how deniers work. If you admit that there's possibly a 1% chance that climate change is not caused by humans, then they say, well, see, then you can't say that. And in fact, it's less than 1% at this point. But we know climate change is real. There's lots of evidence, and we should be just talking about it. I talked about stenography, and it tends to be the rule in politics. This year is something of a change. but probably too late to matter. I was mentioning science again before, and I said before about these studies. We really have to do a better job as journalists and again as teachers of whatever level to not be leaping on the latest study or report of a study that shows that something is either good for us, bad for us, causing cancer or not, and using statistics in a way that is misleading. I said earlier today that journalists are really bad at math as a rule, and it's embarrassing, the errors that we see in journalism because people can't multiply or don't take the time to see if something makes sense or not. This is I won't go into the details, but this is a case where the New York Post, it's completely obvious from the story they didn't do the math. They didn't check because what they had come up with could not possibly be true. And I won't go into the details, but if they had spent even 2 minutes asking themselves, could this be true? Someone would have, done some basic arithmetic, and they would have said, "Oh no, that's absurd. It's not a 7% increase; it's a 1% increase." And yet, this headline shows up. So I before we do anything, at least let's try and get our math right. Another area of journalistic humor for me is when we say that this happened and then that happened, therefore this caused that. That's the idea that something is correlated does not mean that it's causing the other thing. Probably 100% of mass murderers drank milk when they were children. That's not causation. And the example here, again, is so ludicrous that I really suspect if any actual journalist had looked at this first, but it was there's a category in journalism called too good to check. You just want it to be true because it's such a good story. So if it's too good to check, it's too good to be true is the same sort of thing. One of the people I interviewed for this is a deep space scientist who's an author and very funny guy, and he went off on a rant about journalism. And this is a scientist who writes beautifully, and his books sell a lot, and he's on TV a lot, and he just said, "How come you guys just never do the math? What's wrong with you?" And I didn't have a good answer, but it's the scientists really hate this stuff. The next area I talk about with students, even if we're just reading things, but more if we're creating things, that we have to pay attention to not just laws, but norms, things that we all agree on, or that society says that's okay to do, that's really not okay. So a norm is a norm that we should follow is don't troll people in social media. There's no law against trolling, but but people do it, and I think they're violating norm. But there are some laws that affect what we can do, and I have no idea what copyright law in Greece is, or a lot of other ones, but copyright law is one of the things that it is of real concern to me as a media user and creator, because copyright law leads to restrictions on how we can use and how we can create media in ways that I don't approve of. I believe in copyright, but I think that Hollywood and the industry that basically writes copyright laws that governments then enact have unbalanced things in favor of the owners of copyright. And I don't mean the creators of things, because the creators are not often the owners anymore, at least of the most popular stuff. So this worries me a lot. I won't spend a lot of time on it, but there's this thing called digital rights management. Do you all know what that is? Basically, it's a restriction built into software that may be part of a device you use or something you watch, but that basically says you're not allowed to do what you want with this. And DRM, as it's known, is it's used to take down videos that are perfectly legitimate. It's used, and it's sometimes used for legitimate purposes, but the whole DRM thing is that, at least in the US and in a lot of other countries, if you do anything to break DRM so that you can make better use of the media that you have purchased or are looking at, that you violated a law. And as a result, there are all kinds of things happening that are not just about media. In the United States, farmers have discovered that the tractors that they own, or thought they owned, aren't really owned anymore, because if they want them repaired, they can only be repaired by certain people who have access to the software. So this is spreading into a lot of things we touch, and we should be concerned about copyright as users and otherwise. Another thing that I require all my students to blog. I don't force them to do it publicly, sometimes just inside the course software. But I have to tell them that there are people who might sue them if they say the wrong thing, even if they didn't do anything that was illegal. The United States just had a major libel suit where a Silicon Valley billionaire decided to put a media company out of business, and he's spent millions on lawyers helping other people sue this company. And this was a company called Gawker Media, which some of what they did I did not approve of, but this was a case of using the law to punish media and journalists, and this goes on all over the world, so it's not unique there. And we have to, I think, explain to people that they could be at risk for things. Taking photos in public places is a First Amendment right in the US, but people get arrested for taking pictures of police, even though it's never legal to do that, unless they're literally blocking the police from doing their work. So we have, again, law affecting what people can do. And some countries do ban trolling. And that's a hard thing to know what is it, what's trolling and what isn't. That's a line that's very hard to draw. And if you give people the right to draw that line, I'm a big believer in our First Amendment, and I'd like to see more free speech and not less. So there are things that I think students need to know about that in their media use. And again, the norms, the things that are legal but are not good ideas, I think are more important in this new world, especially with social media. This is a picture of a guy who was driving through a place where he picked up food from a restaurant and was being a real jerk to the person taking his food order. And the video of him being being really a jerk made its way online, and he got fired from his job. Is that excessive? Maybe. I think it kind of is, but I don't think we should judge people on their worst moment when they're being totally jerks, but maybe it's at some level a good thing if we have some deterrence. But these are norms, and I'm sorry, these are too much. I can't go into so many details, but there's a lot of norm violations. I have a rule. This is my own personal law, which is that any piece of information, digital information, that I want to have in the future, I have to back it up. I have to save it in several places, or somehow I'll lose it. However, anything I do online that will embarrass me someday will live forever with no intervention at all on my part. And I try to persuade people that this is the case. And we have to be careful we don't judge people on the one stupid thing they did or said at some point. I don't do that. I have to say I'm very lucky that social media did not exist when I was in my 20s. I don't think I would have been employable after that. I was playing music for a living in those days and living a interesting lifestyle. But if there had been videos of me from when I was 25 years old, I would not be invited to give speeches anywhere. Probably it would just be unthinkable. And I'm not going to say any more about that. So I try to convince people that being a troll is not just offensive, but it could come back and hurt people themselves, and not just the ones they're hurting. Some people are going to do it no matter what because they enjoy it, and I'm never entirely sure what to do about that. But I don't believe in laws against being bad. I believe in laws against being criminal, and the difference is not it's not something that we think about as much as we should. This is a picture of Obama visiting a school a few years ago, and the quote is pretty good advice, which I'm sorry to say, where he said, "Be careful about what they post on Facebook, because whatever you do, it will be pulled up again somewhere in your life." The student had said he wanted to be a politician, and that was the response that Obama gave, but it applies more widely. The thing that, the reason I think that maybe he's wrong on that one is that certainly younger people have moments of themselves being stupid or worse online somewhere. Increasingly, we can't get away from it. If you don't have to take a selfie of yourself when you're drunk, someone will do it for you and put it on Facebook. So it's likely that we've all done embarrassing things in public that are going to remain in public for a long time. So my hope is that we give each other a break, that we say, okay, we're all stupid when we're in our teens and 20s. We all say stupid things. We all do stupid things, and let's say, okay, I don't judge you based on the stupid thing you did when you were younger. And even if you're older, I don't judge you on the stupid thing you did this week if that's not your pattern. If that's not visibly who you are, let it go. We have to let this stuff go. I want that to be the norm. I don't want to let go on consistent bad behavior. I think that's something else. But if we judge people and make decisions about them based on these single bad moments, I think we're doing something dangerous. When I would not want to hire somebody who decided not to have a social media public presence because they were afraid that I'd find out something stupid about them. In fact, I would be suspicious But I'd also want to be sure that it wasn't some, consistent thing in their lives. But it would be, these are going to be things we work out in the next few decades. Real quickly, I want to just mention that I think the media literacy we've been talking about here is more about the media consumption and knowing what's real, what's fake, what's not. But again, I stress to my students that being a creator is part of being literate, and they need to really understand that we're creating media all the time. One of the first things I do in the course is, in fact, the first blog post I have them do is I ask them to take a pencil and paper, or pen and paper, and write down every use of media that they have made for 24 hours. Everything. Some of them take it to extremes by saying, one student said, well, I looked at the digital alarm clock, I guess that's media. I no. But it's surprising how much media people use and create in a day, especially if they're younger. And for most of them, it starts off looking at their phone when they wake up to see what's new on Facebook, and doing things and posting and doing things all day. And most of them find it surprising how much media they consume and create in one day. And it's a wonderful exercise. Try it yourselves for it may horrify you when you realize how immersed you are. I actually, I worry that I'm too tied to this thing. And we have a bedroom policy, which is no phones in use. I use it for an alarm, but I violate the policy sometimes by looking at my email first thing, which I try not to do. But we have to maybe think a little less about these over time. But as media creators, we're not just sharing things, we're creating and we're witnessing, and we're using these tools that this is someone filming a police officer who had just tackled a teenage girl who was in a bikini at a party. Complicated story, but what he was doing wasn't right, and it certainly got a lot of attention. That's a media creation tool that I use all the time. That's a media creation tool and consumption tool. WordPress is an amazing thing for people because it lets everyone create blogs that they want. Again, these things are the most powerful media creation in a long time. Adding location and mobility to our media is really something. But I show them in a course I teach creating animated GIFs, and there's a long debate, is it GIF or GIF? I don't know what you say, but I call it a GIF. And that are really easy to use. You just put a little bit of video into a website and it'll create it for you. I happen to love those things. They're wonderful. So that's an animated GIF. That's not a video. That's a bunch of animations in a GIF. This is from the robotics challenge that the United States government does every couple of years, where they invite people to do things with robots, and the robots are getting really good at what they do. It's kind of surprising. And we create media with things that are truly changing how we look at the world. This is free software you can download, called Ushahidi, to create maps of things that change over time, used in all sorts of places. Obviously, YouTube is in the category. And these tools are letting people like a guy named Elliot Higgins. Has anyone heard of him? man in the UK, Elliot Higgins, created some of the best citizen journalism in the world. He analyzes, with the help of his audience, images and other things from crisis, conflict situations. And some of the reporting that these people have done has been way ahead of the big media. And his site is called Bellingcat, and it's quite remarkable. And they're using open source tools in the most profound way that I have seen in some time. So that's the basic of the creation part, and I go through a lot of complicated stuff in that part of the course. I also ask them to think about the communities that they live in. And we're all in a bunch of online communities at this point, whether they're Facebook or something else. And a speaker yesterday talked about comments. I'm very unhappy to see people turning off comments on websites. I think that's a terrible mistake for a couple of reasons. One is it shows that they're not serious about the conversation that I believe they should have and that we should all be part of in communities of interest. And the other is that usually if they have anything, they say, well, we'll let social media take care of it. That's giving away part of their futures, and that's a bad business move, in my opinion. So I object on several levels, but people do it. And on things where I get to have some input on what we do, those are my rules for online community. It's really simple. We're going to be civilized with each other. If I'm providing the place where we're going to talk, I get to write the rules. And I have the students in one of my courses I have them as an exercise, write the rules of participation for their site that I have them create. And some of them, they don't all just copy and paste from some community rules that I've shown them. Some of them take this thing really seriously, and some of them say anything goes. Some of them say almost nothing goes, but they think about it. They think about what the rules should be of the thing that they're in control of, and that's all I'm asking. If someone comes into my house at my invitation and they spit on the carpet in the living room, I'm going to ask them to leave. That feels like, that they shouldn't do that, and they don't have a right to be in my house. And I believe this is your place if you run something, and we all should run something, and that's my rules. Some guidelines I love, and I think we can learn a lot about media creation and consumption together from a site called BlogHer, which is a women's blogging site that's been around for about a decade. And because, as I mentioned earlier, women have different issues online than men. The amount of abuse women see is much, much greater than men do. And when the founders of this site did it, they thought very hard and long about what they were going to do. They didn't want to prevent people from having the conversation. That was the whole purpose of it. But they came up with, I think, what are the best rules I've ever seen. And for something I started a few years ago, I adopted most of their rules because I thought they were so good. So civility is the watchword for me. Another thing I do, increasingly the students use Twitter. Not all, but the ones who do, I show them how to block people. Twitter has some reasonable controls, not enough, but they're improving. And I don't feel any obligation to read insults from people who just want to troll me, and there are some who do. And that's a good thing. So being able to use these kinds of tools is part of being media literate in the world that we're in. And my message to them in general about what they say and do online is that they own their words. That's true from a copyright standpoint, but it's more importantly true from a what's proper. You have to own what you do. And if people who think about what that means, if they're decent people, are going to realize that ownership implies some responsibility. Again, I can't force people to behave well, but the ones who have good instincts, who think it through, will behave better. And it's really easy to toss off some comment that's not thoughtful and that can hurt people. And I've done it. I've done things where I've sent something out that turned out I was retweeting something that was false. I have to find myself careful at times. The last thing on this, before we talk a bit further, and I want to hear your questions, I mentioned this yesterday. I believe more and more strongly that we have to adopt something called slow news. There's a movement that started in Italy a while back called slow food, which was a kind of rebellion against the fast food culture and the idea that we should do things with food that are from using native foods, cooking them joyfully, and basically slowing down the eating and cooking experience just to make it very much part of us. And slow food became a pretty big thing around the world. I think we need slow news at some level, and it's because of the velocity of information. You've heard earlier about how rapidly things move, and it's become, for me, a real issue. Partly because again, the research data is fairly clear that when lies are spread, the truth doesn't catch up as quickly as it needs to. That doesn't have to be the case, but it is the case. There are ways we can help the truth catch up, but we don't use them. And a lot of it's because we've moved from what we called the 24-hour news cycle to an hourly and half-hourly, but now it's an every second news cycle. Something new, runs by my Twitter feed more than every second. So, if you recall that picture earlier, this was a classic example of fast news, much of which was wrong. And some of it wrong in ways that were extremely bad. And an example of truth not catching up to a lie is in this particular thing. There was a shooting at an airport in the U.S. at Los Angeles, and this NBC News, a big respectable news organization, said the shooter has been killed, and it was retweeted, sent out, a copy sent out by 411 people immediately after NBC says this. Well, the shooter had not been killed, and so NBC sends out another a correction saying, nope, sorry, it wasn't true, but look at the number of retweets. It's only 118. And to me, that's a great example of of the problem that we have, how we have to help ourselves and our students and others just not believe stuff immediately. So I've made a practice of not believing anything in short term. This is another example of where a respected news organization in America announced something that was false. This was a congresswoman who had been shot, and this was, in fact, her husband heard that she had died when she hadn't. That's how that was his day. Think about what it would have been like. And this is the sequence of how badly wrong things were and how they had to pull it back. So I want slow news. I want us to just take a breath before we believe anything, before we trust anything that is not completely confirmed to our satisfaction. And I mentioned earlier science. A friend who's a scientist in the medical research field once told me, because it drove him crazy how much the reporting of medical information was just wrong. And he said, so every time I see news about something having to do with medicine, like a study being reported, he says he automatically puts it in the category of interesting if true. Doesn't believe it for a second, but he said, well, if that's true, that's interesting. I put all breaking news now into that category. All breaking news. And I think my life is better somehow. I don't panic. I don't think I panic generally, but I think I was when we have it, it's part of our physiology that we keep hitting the refresh button. Partly we want updates, we want the things, but if we all basically say, wow, that's interesting if it's true, or that's terrible if it's true. If we always add if it's true in the back of our minds, we're going to be better off, because we won't, our hearts won't race quite as much when we see things that bother us, and we'll wait. If it is true, we'll have time to have problems with it later, but let's just wait. And I think students are starting to do better at this, but this is not something we can expect to happen anytime soon. So the last thing I'm going to do is show you, before we get into questions, is I said I go outside my comfort zone. This is an exercise that I used to do when I was a journalist. I used to write a column, commentary for the newspaper in Silicon Valley. And so I had a front row seat to the incredible change in the valley. And I kept in mind that there were things that were kind of the guidelines for me of what I was going to write most about. And there were many topics I would return to because I thought they were important. And this was a piece of paper I kept in my desk. And it was a list that I kept that was basically things I believed. And I said, these were things I absolutely believed, that were the basis of my journalism. They weren't moral things. They weren't things that were just sort of, scientific. They were basic things as a columnist I wanted to talk about. And for years, one at the top was Microsoft is an abusive monopoly and needs government supervision, because I thought that was very important, because Microsoft was just beating up everyone else in the technology industry and acting badly, I thought. And that was a crucial, big, important thing. But that list, every 6 months, I would save a day or two, and I would relentlessly attack every point on my list. Call up people I knew disagreed with me, ask them, okay, I think this is true. I know you don't. Tell me why I'm wrong. What's changed? Sometimes the answer is nothing's changed. You're just wrong. And sometimes they really believe, and I give them within a topic that they want to cover. And now I want you to attack it. I want you to do the research to find out why you might be wrong. And it was for me, it was the most important thing I did in some senses, because if technology moves so quickly that if you don't challenge your own assumptions, you will be wrong. And it helped me not be, I was still wrong a fair amount of time, but I wasn't wrong as often, which is the best I could hope for. And I encourage this kind of exercise and hope everyone would think about that in the context of your own work and your own beliefs, because it's a wonderful way to get outside that confirmation bias zone as well. I just realized that I've gone almost to the time that we're done. Sophia, do we have time for questions? Or do you want to stop? Do we have a... Oh, okay, well, I'm sorry I went longer than I thought I was going to go, but I will say I would love emails of any questions. I will give...
Still, if there is somebody who wants to ask something, go ahead.
I've worn you out. I know I wore me out. But.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for listening. And if you, I would love to get emails, and I promise to answer them, but I don't promise to answer them tonight. Okay. But thank you very much.